Do we need any water up here? Should we make, how late should we make?
Hello. We will be starting in about 2 minutes.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming to Plymouth, Massachusetts to mark this really important anniversary, Association of Field Ornithology's 100 years. So let's give AFO a round of applause. My name is Julie Jedlicka, and I'm Vice President of AFO right now, and you've probably received too many emails from me. But thank you so much for coming, and it's my hope that you have a wonderful experience face-to-face, which is AFO's first time in 2 years or 3 years. So welcome. A huge thanks to all the other really important conference organizers, our president, Valerie Ferretti, our fabulous event coordinator and know-it-all in a great way, Bob Curry. Our local organizer, Brian Harrington and Elisa Landre. Our treasurer, Scott Sutcliffe, and then David Aborn and Lucy Ziff are also really important. So if you see them, please thank them. They've done wonderful jobs. We really appreciate it. And as a little plug, I'd also like to thank Claire Ramos for helping organize the judging of Student Presentation Awards. We also need a few more volunteers to judge. So Claire's right over there. See her, go say hi, introduce yourself, and say, I'd love to help you judge Student Presentation Awards. It means a lot and gives really good feedback to our students, so please feel free to do that. We are very grateful. We've had such wonderful sponsorship for this conference. So a huge thank you to 2 organizations that are local here, provide tremendous birding opportunities, both Mass Audubon and Manomet. And we have Avanet Research Supplies, which is AFO owned and operated. Feel free to talk to Patrick for more information about Avanet. They're bronze sponsors, thanks. And then some really awesome organizations that, as bird lovers or ornithologists, you probably know about. Wildlife Acoustics, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, Birds of the World, and Feather Friendly. So thank you to them. I want to take this time at the beginning, opening ceremony, to just talk a little bit about how AFO is creating a safe and supportive environment for learning. I'm going to read our safe statement. So we welcome everyone to AFO100 and celebrate diversity in all its forms. AFO100 is dedicated to providing an inclusive environment that is collaborative, supportive, and engaging for everyone involved, and that is free of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. Thus, we expect all meeting participants to adhere to the code of conduct throughout the conference. In the hopefully unlikely event that the code is breached, we ask that individuals report incidences immediately to the AFO Safe Committee at email address safeafo100@googlegroups.com. Alternatively, instances can be submitted anonymously to the comment box at the silent auction, along with any comments, concerns, or questions for the AFO Ethics Committee. So the silent auction and the comment box will be in the Atlantic Room following this event for our reception. But thank you to AFO Safe Committee for that. And importantly, it's my privilege to welcome you here on Indigenous Peoples Day. So a hugely important national holiday and recognition. We are very honored to be able to have Melissa Ferretti, Herring Pond Wampanoag Tribal Chairwoman, with us today to provide a land acknowledgement. She is a third-term tribal chairwoman and is a first term of the Town of Bourne Select Board member. So Melissa, please come on up.
Wow, nice group tonight. Wanina Khan, good evening. My name is Melissa Ferretti, Natasuis, Melissa Ferretti, Nutomas, Sikwana Makwapakwit, Wampanoag, Ka Natai Patuxet, Borndalet. My name is Melissa Ferretti. I am from Herring Pond, Wampanoag, of Plymouth, and of Bourne. So I'm going to start with just a little prayer. The thanksgiving for a good mind, as it seems we're here today to learn. So manat katampatonto mawash wachi wami maki sionish katapantuto mawash wachi nawitap naton wahat anak. Creator, I thank you for all that you have given me. Thank you for giving me a good mind to learn. So I have been asked to also offer the land acknowledgement. Today, if you do not already know, land acknowledgements are used by Native peoples and non-Native peoples to recognize the first people of this land. Those are who are the original stewards to this place which we all now live. Today, I will share a condensed version of what would, of course, be a much larger acknowledgement. Today, we give thanks to this sacred place at Patuxet, what is known today as Plymouth. The sacred land that lies beneath your feet is at the heart of what we call the Wampanoag Nation and the traditional homelands of my people, the Herring Pond Wampanoag tribe. We have called this land home for thousands of years. Our ancestors are buried here, and our descendants can still be found here walking amongst you today, along with the many other tribal communities and direct descendants of other tribes throughout the Commonwealth. The history of Plymouth and the Massachusetts colony as a whole is extremely complex, as we know. What happened here on these lands impacted all Native nations across New England and spread far and wide across this country and into the Canadian Maritimes. The spread of colonization resulted in armed conflict, assaults, enslavement, dispossession of land, and was a direct assault on all Native culture and life ways. But as we begin and move on today and think forward, let us not forget the first peoples of this land. Aho, thank you.
And here is Vale Ferretti of the same last name. How coincidental, AFO president.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Melissa. And good evening, and welcome to the 100th meeting of the Association of Field Ornithologists. It is an honor and a pleasure for me to be here today to celebrate the first 100 years of our organization. And it is even better that after 2+ years of pandemic, we're doing that in person. I want to thank all of you for making AFO the vibrant, professional, and non-professional ornithological organization that we have today, and all the past presidents and leadership of AFO who helped carve this path over the years and generations. I hope the next 100 years will be as rewarding and exciting as these past 100. At one point, I actually thought that during the 2 years as president of AFO, I wouldn't be able to be standing here talking in person in front of you. But we made it, and we learned some things along the way. We actually learned how to master Zoom and other virtual meeting programs. And in fact, this is allowing us to live stream this opening ceremony and keynote address, also thanks to Matt Schumer. It also forced us to think of ways to connect with our members throughout the year. And that led to our monthly AFO cafes. And for those of you who don't still know what the AFO cafes are, these are informal talks about birds that we have once a month, and we do this virtually. And also led to our grad students and early professionals quarterly webinars with our friends and partners from Wilson Ornithological Society. It led to more frequent committee meetings within our organization, and what's most important, we've been able to connect with our members from different countries and continents. And members throughout the different regions have been able to participate and even give live presentations to others thousands of miles away. You might ask, and would like to know, what the immediate plans for AFO are going forward. You will hear about that at our members' business meeting on Wednesday, but I will say that one of our main objectives is to expand our reach to be able to provide opportunities for marginalized communities in the US and abroad, and in general, to people from countries where support for ornithology is minimal or lacking. We've been doing this already through our Bergstrom and Scotch Awards, by making our journal, the Journal of Field Ornithology, openly accessible and providing waivers to those that cannot pay the open access publication fees. We've also committed to organizing a joint conference with partners in Latin America every 4 years. This is the Ornithological Congress of the Americas that we are going to have next year. And this happens in Latin America, to facilitate the participation of students and researchers that do not have funds to travel to the US to attend a scientific meeting. Instead of just saying that we welcome them to come and participate here, which of course we do, but with all the difficulties associated with international travel, we are going south to participate in a joint meeting. But we do need to do more, and we will be working on that. We need to increase the diversity of our governing body and of our committees, and we also need to get the information of our programs and what we do beyond our regular channels. I hope that in the coming years, you will see changes in this. I do not want to take too much of your time, as we're all looking forward to hearing Dr. John Kricher give his keynote address, but I do want to take some time to acknowledge all the past presidents that preceded me. Tonight, we should make a toast to them and to the next 100 years of AFO. So I will be showing you here a slideshow of the past presidents. Some of the slides have a lot of information, and I'm just hoping that throughout the conference you'll be able to see this slideshow again and be able to read some of the information that we got. For some of these past presidents, we don't have a lot of information. If you do have some information, please come talk to me. I would like to have that and add that to our slideshow. Well, thank you to all the And now it is my pleasure to introduce our invited keynote speaker, Dr. John Kricher. Dr. Kricher is a professor emeritus of biology at Wheaton College, Northern Massachusetts, having taught there for 48 years various courses in ecology, ornithology, and vertebrate evolution. He graduated from Temple, where he got his undergraduate degree, and got his PhD from Rutgers University. His principal area of expertise is ornithology and has been involved in the leadership of various ornithological organizations, providing an outstanding service to our discipline. He has served as president of the Association of Field Ornithologists, the Wilson Ornithological Society, and the Nuttall Ornithological Club, and is a fellow in the American Ornithological Society. He has also been a member of the boards of directors of the Manomet Center for Conservation Sciences, the New Jersey Audubon Society, and the American Birding Association. Dr. Kricher is the author of over 100 papers and articles in scientific journals and magazines and newspapers. He studied North American migrant birds on their wintering grounds in Belize and has led trips to many tropical regions. These travels have formed the basis for his books. He's the author of the new Neotropical Companion, Tropical Ecology, The Balance of Nature, Ecology's Enduring Myth, Peterson Reference Guide to Bird Behavior, and the soon-to-be-released second edition of Galapagos, A Natural History. Although I live in the Neotropics, his widely used book, A Neotropical Companion, was my first introduction to the ecology of the Neotropics as an undergraduate student. And I am extremely happy to finally have met Dr. Kricher in person here today. We're most definitely grateful for his passion and birds that led him to a path of contributions to ornithology and to the ecology of the Neotropics. And Dr. Kricher will open our centennial celebration with his keynote address, A Century for the Birds. Thank you, Dr. Kricher.
If Joe Biden can get away without a mask at the podium, so can I. Well, it's nice to see you here. Thank you very much for that kind introduction and the invitation to be here tonight. It's somewhat stunning, but I'll do the best I can. No PowerPoint. I didn't choose to use one tonight. Why? 2 years of not being able to have face-to-face meetings, and sadly we still can't. We have a face-to-mask meeting, but still. I like to look out on an audience, and I like to see the people. And I don't mind PowerPoints, hell, I'm rather good at it. But I just decided tonight I wasn't going to do it. I want to welcome you all. Most of you are probably not strangers, but some of you are, to Plymouth and to the centennial meeting of the Association of Field Ornithologists. You might wonder why we chose to meet in Plymouth. Why Plymouth, Massachusetts, of all places? Well, we were founded as an organization in Massachusetts. We have a history in Massachusetts. We were incorporated in Massachusetts. And we lost that incorporation because we forgot to keep it up, but that's another story, and we got it back again. Remember that, Ted? Yeah. We have very strong historic ties with the Massachusetts Audubon Society. We've had several meetings in Massachusetts Audubon Society sanctuaries, and we also have very strong historic ties with the Manomet Bird Observatory, now Manomet Incorporated, just down the road a piece. The nation's oldest bird club. There's a trivia question for you if you get away from Massachusetts. What is the nation's oldest bird club? It turns out to be the Nuttall Ornithological Club, Cambridge, Massachusetts, founded by William Brewster in 1873. Brewster and several others. Brewster, incidentally, was 20 years old at the time. So all I'm leading up to is that Massachusetts has a phenomenal ornithological history, and this couldn't be a better choice. It is Indigenous Peoples Day, and I'll add one thing to the statement about Indigenous peoples. They've been in North America longer than anyone else, and in that long tenure, I am not aware, in spite of the fact that they were the first ornithologists in North America, they understood a great deal about birds. They relied on birds very heavily in multiple ways. I don't think any species of bird became extinct when only the indigenous people inhabited North America. So let's go back for a little journey in time. Think about it a little bit. We've got some field trips coming up. What about the ultimate field trip? Back in time. You get in a boat and you go out into Cape Cod Bay and you start counting the great auks. You look up in the sky and you see flights of passenger pigeons. You go to a marsh at low tide and there are Eskimo curlews. You don't pay much attention to them, there's so many of them. You look at all the other shorebirds too, because there were vast numbers of them then. You look up in the sky during migration, and the numbers of geese and swans and cranes. You go to the outer lands of Cape Cod, the sandy scrublands, and you see what look like prairie chickens, heath hens. All of those species were here, and if you got really lucky, you might see that most enigmatic of all of them, the Labrador duck, right here in Massachusetts. But let's talk about AFO, 100 years of history. So many changes, so much history. We formed in 1922, and through our efforts, that includes our journal, our annual meetings, our collective research efforts as field-based ornithologists, not a trivial point there, has served, think about it, thousands of people in the century. Thousands of people wanted to learn more about birds and contribute to bird knowledge. think about this too. That would not have been possible had it not been for the dedication of so many people. People who gave their time, their work, in many cases their treasure, all on a voluntary basis to sustain this organization over the years. You can talk about impact factor of a journal, an important thing. But think about the historic impact factor of an organization that can endure for 100 years. What an effect we must have had. And with that said, since it is the people who run the organization who keep the organization going, I'd like to follow up on Valet's acknowledgement of past presidents and ask anyone here in this room, and obviously I'm not asking people who aren't in this room because they wouldn't hear me anyway, but anyone in this room who is a past president, would you please stand so that we can acknowledge you? We have any past presidents here? Stand up. Have at it. And would you please remain standing just for a second? Next, I'd like to ask anyone in this room who has served as an officer, counselor, or editor to also rise so that we can acknowledge you. Officer, counselor, editors, up with you. Thank you very much. You can be seated. It just goes to show it takes a village. You know what, though? It also takes a future. It takes a future. And thus, I would like to ask any of you who are students, graduate or undergraduate, who are here at this meeting, you're the future. Would you rise so that we can acknowledge you? Thank you very much. Thanks. You can be seated now. How many of you have heard of, know of, or might even be a fan of the singer, gravel voice singer known as Kris Kristofferson, country singer, Western star, you know, that kind of thing, right? When I got the email from Valet offering me this gig, the first thing that came to mind was a Kris Kristofferson song. It's called Why Me, Lord? It starts out, why me, Lord? What have I ever done to deserve even one of the pleasures I've known? So I could just as easily ask the question, why me, AFO? What have I ever done to earn the honor of standing before you on this celebratory centennial meeting of the Association of Field Ornithologists? It gave me a lot of reason to think, and we'll get to it eventually. And it's not as simple as it sounds. Okay. I think that North American ornithology, as it's currently defined, is barely 200 years old. You can skip the first couple of 100 years because there were other things going on after that boat full of immigrants landed at Plymouth Harbor. But beginning in the 19th century and actually the very early part, or latter part of the previous century, ornithology did come to North America. It came in the form of a young man from Scotland who was named Alexander Wilson, the first ornithologist of North America, of the United States. Wilson arrived as a 27-year-old in 1794. He was born in Scotland in 1766, and he died in the US as a relatively young man in 1813. But here's why he was our first ornithologist. What he accomplished was stunning. A 9-volume work on American ornithology, illustrated by Wilson, with the descriptions by Wilson, which included many really astute natural history observations about birds. It was Wilson, for instance, who figured out male bobolink plumage. He did a straightforward thing. He kept a captive male bobolink through the summer and simply watched the plumage change. And he realized that these things called rice birds were actually transitional male bobolinks. Straightforward, experimental ornithological science. It was Wilson who had the patience observing in Frankfort, Kentucky, to describe an absolutely immense flock of passenger pigeons, estimated to be 2 billion birds. That's the number he suggested, 2 billion birds. He watched that flock pass for 5.5 hours, and he never once looked at his phone. When Wilson came to the United States, he didn't have a bird book. He didn't bring a guidebook. They didn't exist. He wrote the first one. And he had help from a man in Philadelphia, William Bartram, who knew some of the birds. And so Wilson got off to a start with that. Now, okay, that's the beginning of ornithology. Now we're going to skip most of the century, because what happened next was the era of shotgun ornithology. Out west in many other places, collecting vast numbers of birds to study them, to study skins, and to learn how to identify these birds as best they could, holding them in the hand and looking at them. There's a great many people who are involved in that, who have names you would recognize for some of the birds, but we're not going to dwell on them at all tonight. I want to move toward the end of the 19th century, when it became more interesting. I'm not saying that it isn't interesting to describe birds in detail and to make collections of bird study skins from museums, but I am saying it's really interesting what you can do when you realize they're alive. And so that's where I want to go now. What was happening was that field study and bird conservation were beginning to move into the concept of just going out and collecting birds and having your cabinet of curiosities, so to speak. And at the same time, science was progressing in ornithology. The AOU was founded by William Brewster, Elliott Cowles, and Joel A. Allen. And George Bird Grinnell founded the National Audubon Society. He made a couple of mistakes. One is he didn't charge any dues, and you don't have a society that works well without that. The other is he didn't name it the National Wilson Society, but probably too late to change that. It was being noticed that not only birds, but other forms of wildlife were in decline. It was just really getting a little out of hand. Birds were appearing on women's hats, not just feathers from birds, whole birds. There was wanton slaughter of birds, because this is hard to believe in the context of our daily lives, but birds had no protection. You could go out and pop them all you wanted to. And so there was a movement beginning toward conservation. This was also exacerbated by the realization that bison were being slaughtered. Animals that were in the millions were disappearing. And you can say, of course, the same thing about passenger pigeons. And so here in Massachusetts, in 1896, Harriet Lawrence Hemingway and Minna B. Hall began the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And they were trying to persuade their fellow socialite women in Boston to abandon their love of feathers and plumage and dead birds on hats and just not do that anymore. And they were successful eventually. William Brewster was made the first president of the Massachusetts Audubon Society. He served in that role from 1896 to 1913, and you saw our first president, Edwin Howe Forbush, Edwin Howe Forbush was the president of the Mass Audubon Society from 1914 to 1925. So conservation was becoming a much more important focus in ornithology. And several different acts were passed which started to confer legal protection on birds. There was the Lacey Act of 1900, the Weeks-McLean Act of 1913, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. And now it was illegal to transport birds across state lines. It was illegal to go out and kill non-game birds. And so that made a difference. And toward the end of the 19th century, even individuals who were dyed-in-the-wool collectors, who never left the house without their firearm, without their fowling piece, began to give it up. One of them was William Brewster. I mention him a lot because his importance in ornithology is often underestimated. It's not understood as clearly as some others. But Brewster, on August 8th, 1890, wrote these words: "I left the gun at home for the first time in my life and did not once regret it either." Up to that time, he had contributed 30,177 bird skins to the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology. That's part of the collection today, and that collection is one of the most valuable collections in the world. Do not misinterpret my remarks. I don't think it was a mistake to collect birds. But, you know, the expression, everything in moderation, it was getting to be out of hand. And in fact, even some ornithologists admitted that and said, we need to figure out how to collect birds in a more efficient way that doesn't involve as much slaughter. The other thing that was happening is people decided, because a little bit of technology here, at the beginning of that century, the 19th century, the technology was this. But by the middle part of the century and on toward the latter part, it was this. Opera glasses and field glasses were being used more and more. Amazing what you can see about birds when you look at them a little more closely in field glasses. Two women were remarkable in what they wrote about birds and the influence of getting people to look at birds more. They were very talented. The first was Florence Merriam. When she married, she took the name Florence Merriam Bailey. She was born in 1863 and died in 1948. Listen to the names of her books: Birds Through an Opera Glass, Birds of Village and Field, The Birds of the Pacific States, The Handbook of Birds of the Western United States. She had relocated to the West early on. And a rip-roaring yarn called A Birding on a Bronco. Florence Merriam Bailey did a fine job of exciting people about how birds behave, how birds look, how to find them, how to master them, how to listen to them, how to learn their calls. And there was one thing, however, that Florence Merriam Bailey really lamented about, and that was the subject of bird names. No, not what you're thinking. Not the eponymous names. She thought that some birds were just badly named. And here's what she wrote. Like other ladies, the little feathered brides have to bear their husband's name, however inappropriate. What injustice. Here, an innocent creature with an olive green back and yellowish breast has to go about all her days known as the black-throated blue warbler, just because that happens to describe the dress of her spouse. Then there was Mabel Osgood Wright. She lived from 1859, the year The Origin of Species was published, to 1934. And she taught people how to go out and look at birds and learn what they were doing by paying attention to them. She wrote a book called Birdcraft, Field Book of 200 Song, Game, and Water Birds. She wrote a book called The Making of a Birdcraft Sanctuary. How many books are out now telling people how to change their backyards, change their front yards to accommodate more birds? And she wrote one I just love. I really, really like this book. The title it speaks for volumes. It's called Citizen Bird, Scenes from Bird Life in Plain English for Beginners. That's Mabel Osgood Wright. The curious thing about that book was it was co-authored by Elliott Cowles, one of the great collectors and bird describers of the 19th century. And I really do believe that Florence Miriam Bailey and Mabel Osgood Wright played a very strong role in bringing in people to look at birds in a different way and influencing what would become bird conservation. But enough about that century. Let's get into talking about bird banding. All right, we can do the Audubon thing. 1803, Phoebe's in a nest in Mill Grove, Pennsylvania, tie some silver threads around them and let them go, and then the next year you see that a couple of those birds are back again. That was not really bird banding in the sense we understand it, but it did establish breeding site fidelity as Audubon understood. That was kind of a one-off because I don't think Audubon did much more along those lines. Paul Barch was actually of the Smithsonian. I'm only mentioning this because it's got a kind of strange, it hit me in a strange way. Paul Barch of the Smithsonian Institution is credited with the first modern bird banding in the U.S. He banded 23 black-crowned night herons in 1902. 23 black-crowned night herons. Why? If you're going to ban something, don't ban a dinosaur that's going to grab you. But he did. And the American Ornithologists Union recognized in 1908, drum roll please, that bird banding was a legitimate area in ornithological research. Yes. So, our organization, the Association of Field Ornithologists, was not the first bird banding association in the U.S. The New Haven Bird Club beat us. They were doing systemized bird banding before we did. The American Bird Banding Association was formed before our society was formed. It formed in 1911, or actually 1909, and it was housed in the Linnaean Society. That's the American Bird Banding Association. The acronym was ABBA. The systematized collection of bird banding data was given over, it was realized that so much bird banding was going on, it was a runaway hit. Why? Because you had the bird in the hand, you could look at it, you could study what you wanted of it, and you didn't kill it, you let it go. It had a certain mystique to it that it remains today. When you take students to see birds being banded, and they get to hold a bird and release it, hold a bird and just release it, it's magic. And, oh, by the way, I was curious about ABBA, the American Bird Banding Association, so I Googled it. But I made the mistake of being a lazy Googler. Instead of American Bird Banding Association, I Googled ABBA. I got 136 million hits of an Australian singing group. Mamma mia. Our organization was born in 1922. That's when we organized. We called ourselves the New England Bird Banding Association, or if you want to call it, NEBA1, first name of the organization. It formed following a meeting that was held in the previous summer by Lawrence Fletcher, whose photo you've seen up on the screen. That was in August of 1921. And the dues for our nascent organization were $1. So in 1922, a lot of people don't realize historical context really matters. And I thought, just out of curiosity, I said to myself, what do you think was going on in 1922 when our organization was formed? So let's take a couple of steps back into the days of yesteryear, a century ago, and find out. Well, first, some bad news. This is really hard to believe. But apparently, there had been a global pandemic of influenza in the years just previous to that, killing millions of people. Can you imagine such a thing? And we get back 100 years later, and we can imagine it only too well. I have no joke for that, it doesn't deserve one, but that's just a coincidental reality. Secondly, on the political front, it was the year the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was formed. The Russian Revolution, I believe, started in 1918. And so the USSR, as it was known, was formed in 1921. Isn't it good to know that we have outlasted the USSR, which which pretty much collapsed in 1991? I only wish the threat level were lower. Prohibition. We're going to go to a mixer after this. I assume there'll be little spirits and stuff like that. We couldn't have done it in 1921, 22, whenever it was, 22. We couldn't have done it then because prohibition laws were in place preventing the sale of alcoholic beverages. In fact, they were strengthened in that year. And on a bird-related front, King Tut's tomb was discovered. Why on a bird-related front? Well, if you want to talk about bird collecting, folks, you go back to Egyptian pharaohs because they were good at it. And while it's not King Tut, I can't help but share with you some information about Ramses III, pharaoh of Egypt, who collected 680,714 bird skins. Quite a cabinet of curiosities. Now, of course, he had people that went out and did that, but it was harder to do then because there were no firearms. So they threw sticks at them and they netted them. I got that little tidbit of information from a book called Birds and Us by Tim Burkhead, which I strongly recommend to you. Well, enough about 1922. 1924, we decided it was time to change our name, and so we went to the new name of the Northeastern Bird Banding Association, NEBA2. And that was our name for a long time. If you're going to have an organization, I wasn't even sure I understood this when I was first a student, but if you're going to have an organization, what is it for? You have an organization so like-minded people can come together, exchange information on, in this case, bird banding research. But what do you do with that information? You have to disseminate it somehow, make it possible for other people to read it. You need a journal. And so the Bulletin of the Northeastern Bird Banding Association first appeared in 1926. And within a few years, it was changed to Bird Banding Journal of Ornithological Investigation. And then further down the line, in 1978, it became the Journal of Field Ornithology because it was obvious that the journal appealed to a broader group of field ornithologists than people who are entirely focused on bird banding. Bird banding factored in to a lot of publications at the time, including a delightful one by Edwin Howe Forbush, who was the president, who, as I said, was the first president of NEBA. Forbush wrote a 3-volume series called Birds of Massachusetts and Other New England States. It is a classic, available still today if you want to try and find it in the various outlets for finding rare books. And it had the usual thing of describing the name of the bird, alternate names for the birds, because it wasn't fully agreed upon as to what common names should be. Description of the bird's nest, something of the migratory habits of the bird, but then there was the real meat of the book, a section called Haunts and Habits, where Mr. Forbush wrote about the behavior of these birds. And bird banding popped up now and again in that. In the account of slate-colored junco, Forbush wrote about how bird banding at feeding stations, because it was easy to catch them then, there were no mist nets then, so you had to catch them in little food traps, had increased the understanding of junco molt. And Forbush called this a little-known phase of avian history. Imagine how much bird banding has contributed to the knowledge of molt in birds since that time. Forbush also in that account discussed the bird banding efforts of Lawrence B. Fletcher, who lived in Cohasset, Massachusetts at the time. Fletcher had banded lots of juncos in the winter at his feeding station, and some of these banded birds returned the next winter. He suggested, Fletcher did, that maybe they traveled together. Maybe it was a band of juncos traveling together, going from breeding area to wintering area. It was getting interesting in terms of what we were deriving from bird banding. And then in our journal, in 1929, was one of the most important papers in many ways that we ever published. It was written by somebody who's no lightweight in ornithology, Ludlow Griscom. But the title of the paper is The Role of the Amateur. And Ludlow Griscom wrote this about amateurs. Wherever I turn in my ornithological work, and almost wherever I have gone in the field, the amateurs have been before me and left on record information of the greatest value and help. I, for one, hope most earnestly that they will carry on in ever-increasing numbers. And this is something we have always stood for, something that was reinforced by AFO President Elisa Landry in her address to the AFO at its 75th anniversary meeting in Costa Rica. And it's something we continue to emphasize today. Where would we be without the amateurs? Well, I can give you a direct example of how important this is. In the 1950s, if you go through a number of our journals, you'll read about something called Operation Recovery, which occurred in the East Coast in the fall during migration. Operation Recovery was invented by a person named James Baird. You saw his picture up there. Ian Nisbet, Aaron Bagg, and Chandler Robbins. And what they did was try to coordinate a group of professional and many amateur bird banders in about 22 coastal banding locations from Briar Island, Nova Scotia, south to Caffey's Inlet in North Carolina. The idea was for people to go out during fall migration, net birds, band birds, release birds, and then see if they would be recovered subsequently as they moved further south. All this with important details on weather to try and establish what weather patterns influenced the movement of these birds. So that was a great combination of amateur and professional ornithology, and something I remember from my teenage years that I thought, boy, I'd like to be involved in that. There was a legacy to Operation Recovery. One of the places that they banded birds was on a bluff just south of Manomet Point, just down the road a piece. And that bluff became the Manomet Bird Observatory under the directorship of Kathleen Anderson, we all knew as Betty Anderson, opening in 1969, I believe, and served as a banding station for many years, and it still does. Manomet's been banding for a long time. Known for many things, not the least of which was a very successful intern program not long after it was founded. Many important names in ornithology passed through the net lanes at Manomet in their rise as ornithologists. Let's talk a little business. Business people. Well, there was a businessman who is profoundly important to this organization, and that's a man named E. Alexander Bergstrom. You've all probably known and are aware of the Bergstrom Awards. Well, they're named after this gentleman. He was the editor of bird banding from 1951 to 1971. He skillfully managed NEBA's mistnet business starting in 1956. These are long periods of time. He was an active bird bander, having banded 35,000 birds in his lifetime, many of them in his own backyard in Connecticut. He was vice president of NEBA from 1971 to 73. He got very interested in birds in his years at Harvard when he met the likes of Alan Cruikshank, Ludlow Griscom, Chan Robbins, and a number of other people. Bergstrom was a businessman. He worked for Aetna Casualty and Surety Company, which eventually became Aetna Incorporated in Hartford, Connecticut, until his untimely death at the age of 54 in 1973. Bergstrom set up our mistnet business. He established the fact that we could purchase mistnets, sell mistnets, and make a profit. And this profit was measured in two directions. There's a monetary profit that goes to the organization and helps sustain the organization. But the people who buy those mistnets are bird banders. And so by simply making them available, we're contributing to that. In 1975, after Bergstrom's passing, his unique and unflagging efforts resulted in the establishment of Bergstrom Awards to honor him. And part of that is that to win a Bergstrom Award, you should do some bird banding, you should involve amateurs, and try to publish your data, if possible, in our publication. Seems fair to me. The mistnet business supplemented our budget very well, and after Bergstrom's death, James Siemens, who was to become our investment trustee and direct our investments, was appointed to oversee the mistnets. And Brian Harrington, who I think is here tonight, was the vice treasurer, or assistant treasurer, I guess, for the mistnet account. Now, Brian Harrington is, if nothing else, indomitable in his ability to last. And he kept this position as assistant treasurer for the mistnet account, get this, until 2007, when we moved it to Avanet. So if you want somebody who gave his time to the organization, you got one. I want to mention one more name before I go on to why I'm up here. And that is Margaret Morse Nice. I can't believe there are many of you who don't know that name, but for some of you who may be younger, you may not. Margaret Morse Nice became the 5th woman to receive membership in the AOU. She would become a fellow in the AOU in 1937. So that's the year she was active. She was elected the first woman president of the Wilson Ornithological Society. But she made contributions to all of the ornithological societies, not the least of which was ours. And one of the things that you may not realize unless you go back and look at old journals is that part of the journal used to be devoted to reviews, not just book reviews, but reviews of papers and articles, often in foreign journals. Margaret Morse Nice edited this review section beginning in 1932 and lasting until 1942 when she stepped down. She, in her last year, wrote nearly 200 reviews for the journal. And these were not little 2 or 3 sentence summaries. She translated works in other languages. She critiqued papers, saying this would be better or that would be better. Margaret Morse Nice was amazing. And of course, if you know anything about song sparrows, part of what you know was discovered by Margaret Morse Nice who devoted a great deal of her career to studying that species and others. So she made simply remarkable contributions to our organization and to ornithology in general. All right, so here it is, the full reveal. Oh, sorry, no more time. Why me? Why am I up here? Well, there's a full reveal here. I was not asked to do this alone. Oh, no. I was asked to co-present this address with William E. Davis, Jr., who sits down here in the front. Ted, stand up and say hi to the gang. Do you have any idea where I got most of this information? Ted Davis wrote a history of our organization. That's so important. And there it is. You can go to it. You can read it. It's on our website. Most thorough history of AFO to date, but it doesn't go to the present time. Ted asked me to do the talk solo. We talked about it. We went back and forth about it. But I think Ted feared that when we both got up here on the stage together, we'd simply go into an impromptu Blues Brothers combination and start, just to act out. And before you know it, we would have to be carried off. So, anyway, that may have been wise, Ted. But it still begs the question, why were Ted and I asked? That's a good question. And I think I know. I was on the council in 1982 and 83. Then I became vice president in 1983 and 84. And then I became president in 1984 to 1987. Well, this meteoric rise was particularly interesting given that I was a total carpetbagger. This is what Ted wrote in his history. John Kricher was a relative newcomer to the organization, having chaired its membership committee for a single year before, well, we got some members though, before becoming vice president in 1983. Until 1983, he had not attended a single meeting. What's the matter with you people? Why me? I think I have George Clark, past President George Clark, to thank for my rapid ascendancy. But the interesting thing here is you really did get two for the price of one. Because Ted Davis and I had been friends for a long time. We lived close together. We shared lots of information, and we had similar interests, to put it mildly. And so Ted and I worked closely. And Ted Davis served as vice president from 1984 to 87 and became president serving from 1987 to 1989. That meant that between the two of us, we covered from 1984 to 1989, which is a fair chunk of president's time. We think we got a few things done with the help of some very good people who came to our rescue. And by our rescue, not just Ted and me, but the Association of Field Ornithologists, as you'll see. Most small organizations like us can be described as running to stay in place. You have to stay on it, and you have to rely on your volunteers to do what needed to be done. When Ted and I drove down to Connecticut for our first meeting, me as president, Ted as vice president, with the rest of the council, we found out that the Treasury was in disarray. Not only disarray, there was no array at all. This was bad. This was really bad. It was a very unpleasant afternoon and conversation. And the first thing we knew we'd have to do is fix it. And so Ted and I happened to be lucky enough to know Scott Sutcliffe. And while the previous treasurer went for the hills, I called Scott and I said, "Can you help?" Well, he was very much involved at Cornell Lab, but he said, "Yeah, I come in for a year or two," something like that. And so we brought in Scott Sutcliffe to figure out our money. This is a serious thing, and he did. And he got it in pretty good shape, to put it mildly. But then, as he said, I'm giving you 2 years. After that, I've got to go on my own. So we got a treasurer then who was also a carpetbagger, never having anything to do with this organization particularly, but having an awful lot to do with me. That's Martha Vaughan, who sits over there. Martha's a professional accountant. She knows how to work with accounting practices, not just checkbooks. So Martha came in for 2 years, and then George Mock came in. That pretty much solved the problem, but Ted and I had something else to do too. You've got to do your due diligence, and we had never met Jim Siemens, who was our investing person. So we made a point to visit him in Arizona when we were out there. A nicer man you never want to meet. And he was able to convince us very easily that our investments were well under control, well stewarded, and that's been the case ever since. Problem number 1, Treasury solved. Next came the journal. Well, the journal was going along all right, sort of, but it was running a little bit behind. And the editor of the journal was an editor of a high degree of methodical accuracy, who was also a very busy man, named Jerry Jackson. Now, if you don't know Jerry Jackson, he came to a number of NEBA meetings with his friend, the red-cockaded woodpecker. Jerry is the reigning expert on red-cockaded woodpeckers in this country, one of them. And he's also the person who questioned, one of the people who questioned the sighting of ivory-billed woodpecker back in the mid-1990s. That may jog a memory from you. Jerry had been editor from 1980 to 1985, and I want to say something about editing. It's the hardest job you can do for a journal. It takes the most hours, the most concentration, and it never stops. Every time you go to your mailbox, oh God, another paper I've got to do. Got to send it out, got to do this. So Jerry wanted to go on and do other things. And I asked Ted Davis if he would chair a search committee for a new editor. And he did that, and we found one. One whose face was up on the screen, who was an absolutely superb editor and took us in a new direction. That was Edward H. Burt Jr., who we knew as Jed. Jed passed in 2016. Jed came with ideas. He wanted to make the journal different. He said, I want to shorten the length of papers. Why, Jed? He said, well, I want to put the abstracts in Spanish, and I can get a translator. We should have our abstracts in Spanish. We should have a Spanish table of contents. That was one of his objectives. And he wanted to bring the journal back to publish it in a very timely manner. He wanted it to come out when it was supposed to come out, which he succeeded in doing. So short papers, I remember when he was telling about short papers, we were having a council meeting at Ted Davis's house, and he said, how would you like to get up, this is Jed now, how would you like to get up in the morning, open your journal, and read a paper while you're having breakfast? I want them to be short enough that you could do that. And so I tried it when he took over, and it worked once. So our journal got back on schedule, everything was fine, and we served an international audience. Which got me to wondering. On April 26, 1985, I had to submit my president's report after my first year. And I was sitting around trying to figure out what was my main take-home point to the council. And I said, this doesn't make any sense. We have this international journal. We're now publishing abstracts in Spanish. And we're the Northeastern Bird Banding Association, a regional bird banding association that publishes an international-based journal. So I said, maybe we should have a different name rather than Northeastern Bird Banding Association. What could it possibly be? Well, if we publish the Journal of Field Ornithology, why not call it the Association of Field Ornithologists? I thought that had a nice sound to it. And the council seemed to accept it very well, and within a year, it happened. But there was a subtext to it. It's funny how these little things matter. We were a regional organization, but there was a national organization consisting of 3 bird societies, the AOU, the Cooper Society, and the Wilson Society. And it was called OSNA. OSNA, the Ornithological Societies of North America. And we kept hearing rumblings that, you know, you guys publish a pretty good journal. You should think about trying to join OSNA. But when we made those inquiries, well, you're still a regional organization. And so we thought that by changing the name, that would probably work. Would people actually buy that? They did. So Ted and I tried to promote this as best we could, that this being the name change of the organization, and then try and get into OSNA. And you may say, well, why do you want to get into OSNA? Well, OSNA was the high table of ornithology. It was the elite of the ornithological societies. So it mattered. Not only that, but it was all under one umbrella. So when you got your dues notice, there was the different societies. All you had to do was check them off. What do birders like better than checking lists? Oh, sure, I'll join. What are they called? The Association of Field Ornithologists? Check. And so joining OSNA really did matter, at least in the short run. We had a great membership increase shortly after that, really did. And Ted and I, here's your carpetbagger again. We went to a 1985 meeting at Arizona State University, and we literally appealed to the other OSNA presidents. I'm sure some of them didn't have any idea who I happened to be. Might have known Ted a little better, I don't know. One of them was Frances James, the first woman to become president of AOU. She was president then in 1984. But we got into OSNA, we were taken in, and we were then invited to join the other OSNA societies at a joint meeting in Los Angeles in 1990. But, that sounded good to me, but Mary Clench, president of the Wilson Ornithological Society, suggested an alternative to none other than Ted Davis. She said that she was a graduate of this liberal arts college for women in a little hamlet of Norton, Massachusetts, called Wheaton College. That's where I taught. So Ted calls me up after this meeting with Mary and he said, hey John, how'd you like to host a meeting of Wilson and AFO? And it came to pass, and I will say, it was a darn successful meeting. Well, we're running, well, not that big. I want to make one more point before I wrap it up. And that is that after this, we went to, after this, the society was part of a symposium on the ecology and conservation of neotropical migrant land birds, held from 6 to 9 December 1989. I'm going to skim over the details of that, but it's important for one reason. There were several papers that got a lot of discussion, one by Chan Robbins and John Fitzpatrick and Paul Hamill, that talked about cerulean warblers being slammed on their breeding grounds by loss of habitat and slammed on their tropical wintering grounds by loss of habitat, and pointing out the connectivity between the two ranges and how essential it was not to try and figure this bird out without knowing both areas. The other paper was by the radar ornithologist Sid Gautreaux, who cut his teeth as a graduate student on radar ornithology. And he presented preliminary data suggesting that based on radar stations around the Gulf of Mexico, there was starting to be a rather precipitous decline in the traffic of birds going across the Gulf of Mexico in the spring. It created probably more conversation among us than any of the other papers presented, and there were a lot. There were, of the 326 of us who attended that meeting, there were 12 from Latin America. And those Latin American ornithologists put together a list of suggestions for how we might cooperate following this symposium. They pointed out, migrant birds do not recognize political boundaries. To save these species, we must begin to have similar perspective on the hemisphere. And then they suggested ways to do it, including gringos should learn Spanish. I remember I liked that part a lot. I think that was actually one of their suggestions. But they pointed out this: budget limitations and limited access to basic equipment and literature continue to hinder our research efforts. Through a well-established network of cooperation, North American researchers might consider donating some of their equipment to Latin American researchers after they finish their field work in the Neotropics. That led to something that happened, I think, at that meeting. And that is, somebody said, it's such a simple suggestion. We ought to do it. And something called Birders Exchange came out of that. And Birders Exchange began at Manomet, which was a sponsor of that meeting. And it started fairly quickly and was fairly quickly transferred to the American Birding Association. And while both at Manomet and at ABA, it was under the directorship of Betty Peterson. Now, Betty Peterson was someone who makes a difference. You could take such a simple idea, and believe me, it is a sort of amorphous idea when you think about it. Try to get people to give you their old binoculars, try to figure out who to get to take them to the tropics, package them up, include a telescope. Betty pulled it off. And just a show of hands, how many of you know about Birders Exchange? Have you heard of it? Not as many as you should, because the ABA let it lapse after the untimely death of Betty Peterson. That's how damned important one person can be. One person. And Betty Peterson came up to me one day, and we were very close friends. And she said to me, John, why is your Neotropical Companion not available in Spanish? How many of you know that Neotropical Companion then was translated and available in Spanish? It was done by the American Birding Association. Betty recruited over 40 translators and 2 editors in order to make it happen. The books were distributed for free. Couriers took them down. Finally, it was put on the ABA website and available to many more people. So that all came out of that meeting. Well, back to us. The glass ceiling of the AFO was broken in 1995 by Elisa Landry. Elisa became our first female president, serving from 1995 to 1997. It only took 73 years to have a woman president of our organization. In sharp contrast to me, Elisa's no carpetbagger. She put in a tremendous amount of service for the organization before she became president, continues to do so today. She gave a presidential address in 1997 in San Jose, Costa Rica, and that conference was attended by about 350 or more people. The most significant event, perhaps, was the fact that Alexander F. Scutch presented the first Scutch Medal to F. Gary Stiles, his co-author in Birds of Costa Rica. That was the first year of the Scutch Medal, and later the Pamela and Alexander Scutch Research Awards were also established. This because Elisa was a tour guide for Mass Audubon to Costa Rica and got to know the Scutches and admire them. And Alexander Scutch, one of the great neotropical ornithologists, honored our organization with the Scotch Medal. Since Elisa, the AFO has had 12 presidents, of which 3 have been women, including the present president, Valet Ferretti. Succeeding Valet will be Julia Jedlicka, and she'll be the 5th AFO woman president. But the AFO will have had, for the first time, back-to-back women presidents. As I count, there are currently 15 counselors, 9 of which are women. So we're moving in that direction. What are our field marks as we go into our next 100 years? We clearly have a top-rated journal that's doing just fine. That's extremely important. We are a pan-tropical organization, a pan-American organization, attending and participating in the Ornithological Congress of the Americas in 2017 and 2023. We continue to welcome amateurs. We provide mentoring for both undergraduate and graduate students, as well as financial support. We have a larger tent. We do strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we actually mean it. And the nice thing about this, because I'm involved with other organizations, is it's just as well reflected in the Wilson Ornithological Society and the American Ornithological Society. The code for conduct, at meetings, which all of the societies have in some form or another, speak to the fact that the atmosphere of meetings has changed. It's not a trial by fire. You don't go up in front of people and look at them and say, they're here to figure out all the things I've done wrong. Not at all. And the papers that are produced by students today that I heard during the pandemic are as good as anything I've ever heard and better than most. So I think what it all means for ornithology is this. Birds are not necessarily in a good place, but we as a society are, and we are learning to do it better. As for technology, we have moved from bird banding to tagging birds with colored bands, flags, equipping birds with geolocators, linking individual birds in MODIS networks, following individual birds by satellite tracking. Birds like feathered ETs now call home. And that is a very interesting take. Years ago, I read a book called, it's a hard book to get through, but A Feeling for the Organism, written by Evelyn Fox Keller. It was about Barbara McClintock, Nobel laureate, who discovered transposons, what were called jumping genes. McClintock was interesting because she studied corn, and she studied the different genetics of corn, and it didn't fit Mendelian ratios. So she wandered into her cornfields and walked around. She described it as wandering among corn. She was trying to get a feeling for the organism, to try and help her understand what was going on. We have an easier job. Birds give us a feeling for the organism so much more quickly than a kernel of corn does. If you want to know what a feeling for the organism is with birds, read Margaret Morse Nice's The Watcher at the Nest. Read any book written by Julie Zickafoos, who was on our council from 1989 to 93. Read the life history accounts of Alexander Skutch, of the various birds that he studied. You'll then know what a feeling for the organism is. And that's what connects birds with us so intimately, is that we have that feeling. I was trying to find a quote that I could use to just sum up that point, and didn't have to look far. I knew right where it would be. In his most recent book, A World on the Wing, Scott Weidensaul wrote about a gray-cheeked thrush. This was in the very last paragraphs of the book. This gray-cheeked thrush was carrying a geolocator. Scott recaptured it in Alaska, removed the geolocator, hooked it up to the computer, and watched the magic of the lines coming, showing where this little bird had been over the course of the winter and how it found its way back, made its way back to its breeding ground. And Scott was trying to figure out exactly what it all meant and what feeling he was getting from this. And he said these words, wrote these words. Or maybe it was reverence? Yes, that was it, reverence. For a creature that, despite every obstacle we as a species have placed in its path, continues to hold faith with the wind and far horizons, with the genes and the seasons. Reverence for an endurance and tenacity I cannot match nor fully comprehend, but which leaves me breathless when I am confronted with it. Reverence for this extraordinary bird and the billions more like it, which, by obeying their ancient rhythms, knit up the scattered and beleaguered wild places of the world into a seamless whole through the simple act of flight. May it always be so. That is a feeling for the organism. And the interesting thing is, you don't have to be Scott Weidenthal to have it. I'll bet almost everyone in this room can feel that right now. In his inauguration speech, and this is now, I'm speaking to you, the students, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here. President John F. Kennedy, on a cold January day in 1960, started one of his sentences with, "The torch has been passed to a new generation, born in this century." That's probably most of you students out there. I know it's only 2022, and 22 is still the tender years, but it's falling to you to take over. Roger Torrey Peterson, who was a man of the 20th century, died in 1996, was fond of reminding his audiences, the birds cannot speak for themselves, so I speak for the birds. Consider that. So, students, let your enthusiasm and curiosity guide your research. Let your tenacity and determination guide your research. Let your feeling for the organisms, the birds, guide your research. You will soon own this century, and may the birds be the better for it. I leave you with a heartfelt muchas gracias y buenas noches. Go to the mixer?
Sorry?
Go to the mixer?
Yes. Yeah, so we have a reception in the Atlantic room. If you have questions for John, please talk to him there.
I'll be there in the Atlantic room.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much.